Hello, my name is Thea,
Hi, my name is Stephanie.
I'm Susan.
Hi, I'm Konomi.
and today we're talking about the Lady Bountiful and unpacking white privilege. So, we're going to touch on some certain aspects of our culture, of the image of the teacher, and some of the privileges that are seen in our societies.
Right. So first we're gonna talk about Lady Bountiful by Manners. In the article, she pointed out that the invisible stereotype of good middle class white lady exists in teacher education in North America. So basically, we like this Western culture, we see that lady were like, I mean women were labeled as a good and middle class, like a lady bountiful, like a, it's kind of like a labeling and it's kind of like a stereotype, but it's a social constructed image of teacher that is related to colonialism, heterosexualism, and the capitalism. So like what they call is the white lady bountiful teacher. So in this field of teaching, how do you say, the field of child, how do you say, the field of teaching, I think it's really important to look at the cultural aspect of how uh, we view the teacher ourselves and how the society view the teacher. So actually, what I find very interesting is the cultural differences, like between Western culture and the Asian culture. Like I did a little like research about the image of teacher in Asian culture. So the one research in China actually finds that there are 31% female teachers acknowledge that female teachers are unsuited to work on academic research, and 26% like female teachers think that male capability is stronger than female. And in in teacher conference in a Chinese school, there are 50 female teachers have been asked the question like, what kind of image do you think you should hold as a female teacher? So I think it's a really good question, but there are 45 out of 50 teachers believe, actually they are all female teachers, they believe that females should be tender and considerate, considerable, and willing to give. And only two teachers answered that the most important thing for women in the modern society is to be self-reliance and self-improvement. So, like as we can see that the vast majority of female teachers consciously identify themselves as the traditional role of a woman. So I think this kind of like it's kind of like the similar idea of the white lady bountiful, whereas the Chinese, like Asian culture has also their image, the traditional image of the teacher. So I don't know what you guys are what do you guys think about it, this issue?
Interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, I think it's interesting that the heteronormativity, as the Maynard, the author of Lady Bountiful, points out, the Lady Bountiful seems to be privileged because she is a white woman. But actually, I feel that her subjectivity is not respected because women are expected to take care of the children, and they are not expected to speak out their thought. And so I think she is excluded from decision making. So in my opinion, so as long as we keep the discourse of heteronormativity, we may not be able to reconstruct the image of the teacher.
Yeah, I would agree. It's pretty challenging, especially because they describe it in the article how it's a lot of women go into the profession because they have those qualities that we talked about, like being tender or being taking care of children. That's sort of naturally what people think they're supposed to do. But then they also describe in the article how that might keep early childhood education or other professions sort of under the guise of semi-profession, because it's just an extension of childcare and just an extension of our natural abilities. So that's another really complicated issue that comes with that as well.
Well, yeah, and exactly, like just as you were saying, that heteronormativity and basically the stereotypes, the archetype of the image of the teacher is so prevalent that how do we then disrupt these kinds of conversations? So as Kanomi was saying, like the keeping the discourses open and keeping this going, but then how does that actually happen? How do we change these systems? And so in Minors, that she does talk about how to break these apart, or how do we banish this. She takes into example the Florence Nightingale, how this was like a public proclamation that this was now no longer the image of this. But again, like, how do we go about doing that in early childhood education, and this image of the teacher that we've created? Basically, it's constructed, it's socially constructed, these pieces. So yeah, it's a very interesting intertwining with the other article as well on white privilege and all these privileges that we don't necessarily that we take for granted because they're not spoken of. We talk about so much of other aspects, but not necessarily the privileges.
Yeah, I have a question to Susan and Thea. Actually, so as Thea mentioned, the Macintosh article, White Privilege, mentioned about the invisible white privilege, but this article is written in 1988, so
Yeah,
so 30 years ago. So, do you think the situation is an ongoing situation or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Thea.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's so frustrating. But it goes with both of these scenarios, and I really was a bit heartened. I was gladdened I think it was in Miner's article. They described how it is very, very difficult to change things, and it feels really, you get frustrated because one person, like just me, how could I change such a complicated thing? But I guess this is the start, the beginning. But I was really glad to hear that she found it very difficult as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a continuation. It's not, and it is that, as Margaret Mead talks about, like, it takes everybody, one person, to just step forward, and that is what actually gets the ball rolling. So yes, it is actually us as an individual to keep these discussions going and keep the dialogue open. Oh, sorry, there was a beep somewhere. Yeah, so just to keep that going, and I'm not surprised that it was 30 years ago and that it's still going, because it does take time, as they did both say in that as well. But I think a big piece of this is that ethical responsibility to be vulnerable, to be open, and to speak about these images and these archetypes of these characters that yeah, exactly, as you say, Kanomi, that exclude certain decision-making pieces. So
Yeah, I think I was really like touched by what both of you all of you are saying. Like Konomi points really good the fact that the article was written in the 1988. Like because of that time period, like we are now living in the modern society, and then things are kind of like being changed, but not the concept of that image of teacher has been changed maybe only in that 30 years period. But I think that we, how to say, like we as teachers have something like we can say that from our innermost part, like from our heart, like I think all females are having privilege, like we touch about the topic of privilege, like we very rarely say that we are privileged of something. We only say that we are vulnerable, or we are, or to say somebody else are vulnerable, like more in a minority way or something like that. But we always avoid to touch the topic on privilege. So I think it's a really important point that we need to acknowledge that what is privilege and what we can we can preserve in this concept, like what we can continue, or we may stop it, or avoid it, or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is. It's those uncomfortable conversations that nobody really wants to have, because it really does put you in a vulnerable situation. I think there's something really beautiful of vulnerability. I think vulnerability is taken in somewhat of a negative context in some spaces, but it really is something that opens people up to have more of a dialogue, because when you call yourself out, it opens a space for somebody else to say, oh yeah, I feel the same, or yes, I've noticed that. But if nobody's talking about these silent narratives, and we're denying any kind of, I wouldn't say wrongdoing, but denying any kind of lack of knowledge or lack of awareness, then it's just, yeah, it makes it more difficult to keep the conversation going.
Mm.
So along that line, in white privilege, she talks about how men will often grant that that women are at a disadvantage, but they're less willing to grant that they have privilege, that men have privilege. And then the argument is, of course, that we do that as well as white people. But here we have actually, and most of the programs, there are lots of people who are newcomers to Canada, lots of people who are not white. But do you think just being in a teacher role, does that have some privilege that might play out in the classroom when you're dealing with children? What do you think? So, for example,
really good question. I'm thinking.
For example, maybe if you're middle class, or you at least have the advantage of you're in university, so you'll have a university education, or you're not Indigenous. So how would that play out in the classroom, even if you're not white, for example?
My idea is weird, but you said the newcomers from other countries are not white, but actually I feel the children in daycare center, they're aged 1 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are also newcomer to this world. So we can. I think I cannot. We cannot separate them into white and not white.
Yeah.
What I think is that, answering Susan's question, I feel like I think we are kind of like privileged with our language, because we are from different cultural backgrounds, and we do have this, like, we already be shaped into different kind of characteristics, like in teaching role. So as we as teachers or educators in the early childhood education field, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we do have our privilege, even though we are maybe like newcomers to this Canada as a new country, but we do have our home language that we still speak. And if like children in the center, they don't know how to speak English fluently, they might also be like, as Konomi said, they are also newcomers. Maybe they are just immigrated in Canada or something like that. So maybe as teacher, our role is to guide children in as many ways as possible. So I think it's kind of like a privilege, as the language is. Language is kind of like a privilege to those who are like from different cultural background.
I'm curious what you mean by language in that, Stephanie. Like, which what language are you speaking of? Are you speaking of like an English dialect or a native dialect or a body language, or I'm curious what.
Oh, yeah, I think it's very interesting, like when you mentioned about the like body language, because in different countries we do have different body languages, different gestures, like
Yeah.
different meanings, and but we may use different how to say, different the body language, but for one simple like thing that we want to communicate with each other. So I think that's kind of like the one of the language that we use. And the other language, I will say, I personally I speak Mandarin. I can speak a little bit Japanese and English, but not kind of like dialect. I don't know what do you mean by dialect, but in English. But I mean like it's kind of like multi-language in from my perspective. Yeah.
Do you see that as being a privilege in the classroom then, as having?
Yeah, I feel because if the center, like for example, I was living in Richmond, I have been observed in one of the centers. They are all Chinese children, and maybe most of them could not speak fluently in English, even though we try to speak in English with them, but they might not understand 100% if the teacher give instructions, but the child doesn't follow. That means maybe she or he didn't understand what you're talking about. So I think with this kind of language privilege, we could help children to develop in different like how to say, help them to being adjust, how to say, comfortable in this childcare setting, I would say.
That's a good point. And I'm even having language. I think for a young baby who doesn't have the language skills that we have, even in their native language, I think we have that privilege over children that sometimes we take for granted. But I'd like to point out, I think we're getting close to time.
Okay.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I was going to close up. Do you have something else you wanted to add before I finish?
No, I think our conversation kind of went in a roundabout way, but covered mostly what the articles had to say. I think it was just more of like bringing into question how we continue to disrupt the norms and the regimes of truth of society that we have, and yeah, kind of putting that out too as a provocation for the week. And how do we do that? What are our privileges and how do we speak to them?
I think that's a good way to finish. Thank you, Thea. Thank you, everyone. I think we can stop recording.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.